Yeah, I'll always be a metalhead. Nothing can take that away from me.
Right.
I mean, not jail, not people, not religion, not anything. I'll always be a metalhead, 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 all out.
You're listening to the Great Metal Debate Podcast.
Welcome back to the Great Metal Debate Podcast. Today we have another Metal Debate album review, looking at the new one from epic metalers All for Metal, titled Gods of Metal, to be released on August 23rd through Reigning Phoenix Music. So apparently I missed All for Metal's debut album Legends, released last year. Honestly, I have no memory of it, so this band is completely new to me. Metal Archives lists All for Metal simply as heavy metal, which also matches the language of the promo I received. But for my money in 2024, to identify a band stylistically just as heavy metal is insufficient, and we'll get into my thoughts on appropriate labeling as we get further into the review. Before we dive into specific tracks, I will highlight the notable aspect which really differentiates All for Metal to my ears, which is the use of two male vocalists who provide two different singing approaches. On the one hand, we have Antonio Calana, who gives a traditional power metal to hard rock vocal output along the lines of David Basson or Sozos Michael. Calana is paired with Tim Schmidt, who many might know from his work with Asenblut. But unlike the death metal growls he employs for his other band, within All for Metal, Schmidt gives us a baritone clean voice with false chord technique along the lines of what we've come to expect from Joachim from Sabaton. There may be other metal bands who employ this mix of male singing styles, though offhand none come to my mind. However successful they are in executing this approach, I applaud All for Metal in making mainstay for themselves something different from the norm. So let's jump right into the music. The album begins with an intro piece titled Cry for Help, which has some building instrumentation and epic-sounding spoken words. I have mixed feelings about such intros. They can be very effective, but it's really hard to do so. My favorite examples are where bands use these to foreshadow melodies we'll hear later in the album. In the case of Cry for Help, I could take it or leave it. I tend to agree with Metal Debate contributor Xander that it is often better just to fuse the intro piece with the first track instead of having it as a standalone. The band ramps up the metal bluster to 1,000% on the second track and first full song, Gods of Metal. The guitars are up front in the mix and provide some nice flourishes, although occasionally the keys push past them in the sonic spectrum. As someone who grew up in the 80s listening to bands like Manowar and Accept, whose music was an over-the-top celebration of the genre, this approach isn't new to me. It's fine, but just something I've heard in so many variations, it's hard to get too worked up about it, positively or negatively. Track 2 is Year of the Dragon, and I have to be honest, I freaking love this song. Okay, it's a little corny, but I actually think the Eastern evocative melody works. Maybe because I wasn't expecting to hear this approach, it really resonated with me. As with the previous track, the synths are a touch heavy throughout, but this helps dampen the effects that might otherwise have been too jarring. But more than anything, it's just a fun, upbeat track with verses that build in a singable chorus. The Way of the Samurai didn't work quite as well for me, and maybe here I just thought the lyrics were a touch too over the top. Despite this, Kalana's voice is exceptional, and here he carries most of the vocal load, with Schmidt coming in at points for emphasis. I especially like Kalana's brief falsetto accents in places. The guitars throughout are strong and display some good riffs, or perhaps they just aren't as diminished by the keys as in the previous track. Everything builds to the chorus on Temple of Silence, another strong guitar track. Schmidt's voice is dominant for this song, with Kalana giving brilliant accents. In contrast, on When Monsters Roar, Kalana takes the first voice and Schmidt the second, with the two splitting duties including some fantastic harmonizing on the chorus. The percussion keeps the pace high here, with the guitars nicely audible if a bit slick in their presentation. Path of the Brave gives a classic power metalish ballad. Kalana's singing is superb, but I wasn't a fan of the orchestral melody. Just a touch too sugary for me. I wish they'd let the acoustic guitar take the reins a bit further, maybe open things up a bit with a little less sound. I mean, you don't have to have every track so fully compressed. This was followed by Like Thor and Loki, which on first listen I was struck that I hadn't even noticed we'd transitioned from an East Asian to a Norse aesthetic somewhere in the past few songs. Keeping things in European mythology, the next one up is the synth-heavy Valkyries in the Sky, featuring a strong vocal contribution from Laura Goldeman from Burning Witches. Goldeman is an insane singer and a hell of a front person, and this song is constructed perfectly to highlight her voice. Here we also get a killer solo from guest instrumentalist Tim Hansen from Induction. Honestly, this is one of my favorite tracks on the album, beginning a run of songs that end the album in strong fashion. Speaking of, Welcome to the Wasteland returns to more standard all for metal style, with more trade-offs throughout by Schmidt and Kalana. But the chorus on this one is stellar. Just a great melody, and then with the double bass kicking in at just the right time for extra emphasis and energy. There's no doubt this would be a killer track to hear live with the crowd chanting along, an example of what all for metal does best. Track 11 is Who Wants to Live Forever, which features great effort by both singers, outstanding orchestrations, and the twin guitars making it all work without overstepping their bounds. All for Metal absolutely don't front-load this album with all their best material, as this track is as solid as any on the record. The album ends as it began with an outro piece, this one called The Journey Will Not End, that matches the feel of the intro track. If you were listening to this album all the way through, it makes sense, but I'm honestly not sure how many will do so, and I would have recommended a different conclusion if asked. A few things to say in summary. This was a roller coaster, but for me, the highlights far outweighed the lows. I really like how the band utilized Schmidt and Kalana's voices in a variety of ways, mixing and matching them as was appropriate for each track. To take that a step further, I thought the songs were extremely well written. There was a great balance of aggression and melody, and every element of each track seemed to have some purpose to it. Honestly, there isn't a bad song on this album, albeit I enjoyed some more than others. I have one big critique, and I'll say up front while this needs to be addressed, for me it wasn't a deal breaker. This album is way too overproduced and slick, at least for my taste. There's no feel of rawness to the guitars, and even the sound of the orchestration is fat and soft. To me, this diminished the songs, which I thought were otherwise really well conceived and executed. One final thing I'll say, now turning back to praise for All for Metal, is that they are no mere parody band. Granted, they're not taking themselves too seriously, given their outlandish stage wear, somewhat corny album cover art, and bombastic lyrical themes, but they also aren't doing so ironically. We can pump our fists along with them and not think others will be snickering at us. This is real metal, not to be mocked. As far as what stylistic basket to place All for Metal in, I'll admit it is difficult to pigeonhole them, as the band do pull lightly from a number of metal subgenres, such that it is a mix of power, classic, modern, epic, and symphonic styles. I'd want to call it heavy power metal in the vein of bands like Battle Beast, Dynasty, and Sabaton. Certainly fans of those bands would appreciate the sound All for Metal are going for. In the end, All for Metal's new album, Gods of Metal, surprised me in a pleasant way. It's not crazy innovative, but they have their moments, and the overproduction can be excused given the competent and engaging writing and performances. I'm giving Gods of Metal an 8 out of 10 rating, and would encourage skeptics to give it a chance. You might find something to like here. Gods of Metal is released by Reigning Phoenix Music on August 23rd. You can purchase the album as well as other music, merchandise, and tickets for upcoming shows at the band's official website, allformetal.com.